So roving armies, for example, don't really want to stop and dig up a field of cassava. First of all, they might not even know where it is. In a forest, in a tropical forest, you can hide your swidden plot in the middle of a bunch of trees. You can leave it for up to 2 years, the stuff in the ground, so it's effectively hidden. And then versus a grain crop. And a grain crop has to be harvested at the same time. It has to be stored to be used throughout the year. That is a confiscatable crop. And so it's quite interesting that civilization, so to speak, as we talk about it in the vernacular, emerges out of grain cultures. And grain culture and grain itself is confiscatable, and so it tends towards this organized or stationary crime boss rule that emerges to be the state, a system of laws, and also a system of static negotiations between people whose livelihood is dependent upon this very particular way of farming.
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I talk with Andrew L. Wilson, author and professor of history of Christianity, as well as host of the Disentanglement Podcast, exploring privacy tech and the surveillance state. We discuss in detail several books about the origin of the state and money, including James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State, Rees-Mogg and Davidson's The Sovereign Individual, and David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. We discover some interesting parallels between the unconfiscatability of Bitcoin and the origins of state power, with its ability to tax easily countable grain crops versus something like a potato, which grows underground. We also talk about the history of the printing press as it relates to inflation within the church, and Andrew's personal proof of work, undertaking a 1,000-mile pilgrimage in the footsteps of Martin Luther from Germany to Rome. If you have any questions or would like to reach out, my emails are always open, hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. If you would like to support the show, please consider leaving a review or boosting some sats via your favourite podcasting 2.0 platform. Otherwise, on to the show.
Great. Well, it's great to be here. Cody, thank you for the invitation.
No.
This was I had such a good time talking with you the other day and about a bunch of different stuff from our own childhood, similar kinds of towns, apple orchards, agriculture.
Growing town. Yeah.
Now transitioning into grapes now. But
well, the big innovation that they're talking about in New Zealand is agri-tech, which I'm involved in a little bit. And there's this idea that we can sell technology instead of apples. And I don't know, there's kind of two sides to that. This kind of purely technology-based approach of, IP and kind of infrastructure and kind of digital stuff as opposed to the actual apple. So I don't know, man. I think it's having a balanced economy that does a few different things is important.
Yeah, well, and apples are, too, something that can be grown along with a bunch of other stuff. It's no reason why it needs to be a monocrop, and that's one thing that distinguishes different kinds of fruits from large grains and cereals, is that you can do mixtures of things.
So I was quickly as I could reviewing some of the book recommendations you sent through. So firstly, I want to mention there was a resource that you shared, libgen.is.
Yeah.
Now I thought that was absolutely phenomenal. It's like the Pirate Bay for literature. Is that how you would think of it?
Yeah, basically something like that. It's just a collective who are trying to make academic literature, as well as other literature, but a lot of it is academic, available kind of to people who are not attached with academic institutions. Because as you know, I mean, those are very, very expensive publications. And as somebody who has been involved with writing on the academic side, even that expensive price, say $200, $300 for a book, in no way compensates the authors who would get pennies on that. So I'm conflicted about it because this world of academic writing is really it's a patronage institution. It's a patronage system. The universities and the grant-giving institutions are patronizing it. And then on the other side, you have the publishers who are raking in some of the revenue, usually from libraries, as well as some scholars, the few scholars who happen to have book budgets.
What's a bit of like the Pareto distribution of who gets paid, maybe probably a bit less equitable than that in terms
well, I mean, in academia, you really don't get paid for publication. You get paid for promotion, and the promotion is through the means of publication. So those editors are the ones who stand as something like a gatekeeper to that advancement.
Yeah, and I think though that resource, I mean, I did a quick search of a couple of other books that I have on my reading list.
Yeah.
And they were there. So it was great because, I'm a big reader, and you sent through a couple of recommendations. So we went for a walk the other week, Takao-san here in Tokyo. It's a small, not small, but a nice easy day walk. And we were talking about Bitcoin, philosophy, theology, some of your work. And I found the engagement around or the intersection of your work around teaching the history of Christianity, the history of theology, and some of these emerging ideas of Bitcoin. I saw a lot of connections there that I don't think have really been broached in discussion. I think the way Bitcoin emerged and came on the scene, there's a lot of parallels with some of these historical moments in Christianity. And I mean, that's really what got me interested in talking to you. So maybe a little bit about what you're working on at the moment, what you're occupied with, I guess, as a day job, and then we can jump into some of the other stuff, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, my day job is as a professor of the history of Christianity, of the history of Christian doctrine in particular. So I teach that at a theological seminary and a university here in Tokyo. So I teach to Japanese students, most of whom are not Christian, but who have an interest in Christianity. And in general, an interest in Christian or Western culture. So it kind of, as you know, in Japan, they're Occidentophilic. And so that cultural aspect of Christianity is fascinating for people as well. So I do that. So kind of generally Western civilization is a bit merged with the history of Christian doctrine. So that's my day job. The other, that's teaching. And then my research is specifically dealing with the first encounter of the Caribbean and mainland American civilizations with Spanish. So I specifically study, translate, write about Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar who was one of the first to criticize and try to reform the Spanish project along the grounds of the moral theology of the late Middle Ages, early modern period. So he's a bridging figure in the Spanish-American world, much the way that, say, Martin Luther would be in Europe.
Yeah, that's interesting. My background on sort of literature is a bit lightweight, but there's this great overview that I often come back to, Gilbert Heath's classical tradition. It's very much a kind of an overview of the development of vernacular languages based on, Greek and Latin inspiration, and sort of how the different, Spanish and English and French and German, how they all sort of emerged and took aspects of the Latin and Greek classical tradition into their local culture, and looking at, their relationship between those different places. And it's kind of in my own lineage, but it's difficult from a New Zealand perspective as an island nation to really appreciate that. And so what I look forward to in the coming years is to spend a bit more time in Europe and seeing that flow of culture. And this is something that you shared with me last time we met, but you undertook a pilgrimage, which I thought was very interesting, from Germany to Rome. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, at the time, my wife was working for the Institute for Ecumenical Research, which is in Strasbourg, France. Now, that is a institution, part of what's called the Lutheran World Federation, really had its birth in the growing dialogue with the Roman Catholic Church that was made possible by the Second Vatican Council through the 60s. So that institution was involved in various what are called bilateral theological dialogues between the Lutheran Church, historic Lutheran churches, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Mennonites, Presbyterians, Methodists, etc. So as part of that work, we convinced her board of directors to recreate Martin Luther's 1510, 1511 pilgrimage from the Holy Roman Empire in Germany to Rome. And so we actually undertook that on foot, recreating this historic 1,000-mile-long walk of Luther from the heart of the Holy Roman Empire into Rome. And that was a very, in many ways, an extremely enriching experience. And then after that, I was asked by a publisher to write a book about that called Here I Walk. Here I Walk. So, and that's a pun on this very famous statement of Luther's at Worms, where he said, "Here I stand." So that's partly because we were engaging it specifically to open up channels of conversations rather than to stand and say no, but to see how can one of these traditions historically divided by Luther, how can they be sort of united or linked up by those?
Well, there's certainly a lot of law in Bitcoin related to that. I mean, many people are familiar with the October 31st white paper day and that connection to the 95 Theses nailed to the door.
Right.
And the kind of symbolism of that protest of central banking, some of the writing and kind of early inspiration around Bitcoin. And I think seeing those connections, it lends itself to analogies with Christianity, the development of church hierarchies and structures of belief and kind of ways of being. I mean, what's your take been on that? How have you seen that unfold?
Well, one of the things that I learned in my studies of that very specific event of Luther nailing those 95 Theses, or maybe just sending them to the Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz, is that's very specific indulgence has a lot to do with money, finance, banking, the development of fiat in one way or another. So just to give your audience and reiterate the conversation we had, that particular indulgence which Luther was protesting, first of all, he was not alone in his protest. He was part of the Augustinian order. The Augustinian, they were friars. They weren't Benedictine monks living in a cloister. They were friars living in the city, usually engaged in teaching, preaching, hearing confession. So when people would sin, before they could receive communion, they would be required to confess to a priest, and then the priest would offer absolution and then usually give them a form of penance. And that would be in the form usually of prayers or a pilgrimage, or in some cases, and they could purchase with money a certificate, and that certificate would be named an indulgence. So that was just a general practice. Now, that idea of buying an indulgence for money was a novelty with the Middle Ages. It stemmed primarily from the Crusades and the fight against Islam, and the desire for people to somehow make recompense for the sins that they had committed, first of all in Crusade, and then later it began to expand from that.
Oh, I was just going to say, so you're talking about friars. So is that difference between, say, the cloistered monk and the friar right. is very much in the firing line of everyone's daily sins and kind of confessionals.
Exactly. Like out of the end of the Roman Empire, you had the development of a monastic tradition around the rule of Saint Benedict. Now, those cloisters were apart from the world, living almost in their own self-supporting circular economy. They were not, they usually had a patron in the form of a local sovereign, but over time they developed to be their own sovereign in their own right. And many of these large monasteries, say at Citeaux in France, would have been equivalent to a local lord. So the church, in that sense, was a kind of parallel world to the secular world. It was not, it was holier in some sense, but it was also simply parallel. It had its own economy, had its own financing. Monasteries often became banks. not just of food, but also of money, specie, and they use that to purchase and to be patron of the arts, etc.
Well, it's an interesting historical scenario that is difficult to understand without really talking about it as a narrative, as a in story format, because I think we look at the church in a relatively secular world as this kind of thing that's over there. It has less prominence in daily life and certainly much less political influence than it once did. Whereas once upon a time, as you say, there was this huge amount of power vested in the church structure. And this is something that Rees-Mogg and the authors talk about in The Sovereign Individual, and how this Middle Ages kind of period saw, the landowning, land holdings, kind of the parishes, these all of these structures of ownership and kind of economic structures situated in the church itself. And so the land around the church, was often owned, and how that all worked together, and how that got ultimately disrupted through technology such as the printing press and decentralization of these ideas. And I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but it sort of seems to speak to a way of economic organization, which you mentioned in another book you shared with me, Seeing Like a State, and how these kind of ways of economic organization, generally centrally planned, can have quite disastrous consequences or can be quite inequitable. So I don't. Do you see a connection between those?
The story of the emergence of monastic or the church into a position of wealth through the Middle Ages. You're mentioning how it comes into this position of power, and it does. But it does so in what we have to think of, or what we may think of as a kind of game theoretical reality. So you have a set of collapsing institutions. This is the famous decline and fall of the Roman Empire. You have the flight of specie of gold, mostly to the barbarians. The Romans were paying them. So you have this sort of collapse of local institutions. And as the state disintegrates in that period, many of the functions are picked up by local lords on the one hand, but also monasteries. They come to function to take the place of many of the institutions we might align with the state. And this is actually not as foreign as we might think. I had a friend, actually Kiwi, who was invited to teach a bunch of pastors in Goma, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this was a place in the eastern Congo. There had been off and on a civil war going on for decades. And in this place, the only functioning institution, the only institution which had regularly educated people was the church. And so you saw in a situation, this is modern, this is 15 years ago, 10 years ago, a situation where that function of justice, of exercising justice, of administering a common purse, of poor relief, of negotiating with bandits, of even collecting taxes, tithes in one way or another, in order to exercise patronage over its membership. I mean, this was emergent in the very modern world in a situation of chaos. And this is the world that James Scott describes in that book, Seeing Like the State, the emergence of the state. Anyway, so that's that reality, the role that the church performed in that administrative vacuum came to be very state-like, how we would think about it now.
That's interesting. So there's almost this, I'm thinking sort of universal grammar, Noam Chomsky kind of thing, where the functions of society are replicated to the best of the vernacular ability in the local places that it may be throughout history. The idea of governance, of administration, of social welfare, of banking, these kind of systems, they emerge and they happen to exist currently in a system that's run through government and the apparatus of the state, but historically it was through other means, and there's always a yearning perhaps for people to make that thing happen if it doesn't exist. Is that sort of what we're getting at here, maybe?
Yeah, I think you're right there. There is going to be order. There are going to be people seeking order and making trade-offs between random banditry and organized crime, right? So this is the case of a local organized crime ring offers you protection, and people pay because that protection isn't somehow better than utter chaos. So I think the state, so to speak, and this is from another paper whose reference I sent to you by Meshar and Moav, very, very interesting paper came out 2022, describing the origins of the state in exactly this term. So you have a reality where you have confiscatable goods, particularly in the case of grain, and a competition or an equilibrium that is reached between banditry and random banditry and organized crime. So the state, in this sense, according to Moav and Meshar, evolves as that entity which can gather grain and extracts protection money in order to prevent and defend from banditry. So in that sense, sort of this grain economy is essential for this emergence of the state. So anyway, that's on the one hand, this is sort of the background. So you have in the Middle Ages, you have bandits, organized crime groups, and you have various little pockets of order that are ruled under violence. They're protected, and they have soldiers, and they extract from you, but they offer protection. So I think I mentioned this too because I think modern people, post-Enlightenment, Gibbon and the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, where he blames kind of the lack of virility and the loss of virtues to be the end of the Roman Empire. What's really happening is that the church during this medieval period functions. This is until the emergence of the city-states, starting in the 12th century. The church is taking on a lot of that function. As such, it becomes imbued with corruption and political corruption and all of the accoutrements that all of the negatives associated with that. And so what we have through the Middle Ages are a bunch of reforming movements, of which these friars, first Franciscans and Dominicans and then Augustinians and Geronimites, emerge usually from within these city-states. They are offering critique. And so what you see in Luther and the Reformation that comes out of him is an emergence out usually of an urban environment of a separation of those two realms, or a purifying of the churchly realm to distinguish it from the violent, extractive character of the state. So so Luther's critique of the church is very much also a critique of the church's taking on of the violent role that it had naturally or had assumed in an emergent way over the last 1,000 years.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It really reminds me, these arguments that are brought forth in the sovereign individual, and how, there's that kind of mega political, or is it guns, germs, and steel kind of approach to, there's fundamental elements of human relations, and so you talk about banditry and organised crime, and I wonder though, is that still existing within kind of looking at it today, we look at it as a geographic thing, where there's parts of the world that have more banditry, and then there's parts of the world that have more organised crime. But as we enter into this kind of digital age, this information age of Bitcoin, can that exist in the same geopolitical space, the same physical space, but the individual actors can kind of choose which way they go? And so having something like Bitcoin means you can effectively opt out of both of those situations. However, your neighbours may still be at the whims of the state. And so is that sort of a new paradigm that we're entering in through I guess, the internet, through information technology, perhaps?
I think the simple answer is that time will tell. And I think Bitcoin, in technological terms, is maturing, but in historical terms, it's still in utero, I think. So it's really hard to say what kinds of things will emerge. The historical parallel that was striking to me about that paper I sent you by Moav and Meshar was with the distinction that they make, and it's not their distinction, it's an old one in the history of the emergence of civilization between tubers and grains. So in that case, tubers would be like manioc, cassava, potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, even and other things that are buried and in practice are extremely difficult to confiscate. So roving armies, for example, don't really want to stop and dig up a field of cassava. First of all, they might not even know where it is. In a forest, in a tropical forest, you can hide your swidden plot in the middle of a bunch of trees. You can leave it for up to 2 years, the stuff in the ground, so it's effectively hidden. And then versus a grain crop. And a grain crop has to be harvested at the same time. It has to be stored to be used throughout the year. That is a confiscatable crop. And so it's quite interesting that civilization, so to speak, as we talk about it in the vernacular, emerges out of grain cultures. And grain culture and grain itself is confiscatable. And so it tends towards this organized or stationary crime boss rule that emerges to be the state, a system of laws, and also a system of static negotiations between people whose livelihood is dependent upon this very particular way of farming. Whereas, and this is something James Scott talks about in Seeing Like the State, and also in his later book called Against the Grain, where societies whose calories come mostly from unconfiscatable root crops tend towards being tribal and do not actually develop. They don't develop what we would recognize as the apparatus of civilization, justice, courts, kings, hierarchies, trade, economies, partly because they don't have to, because if the state comes along or there's nothing to take.
That's fascinating. I'm seeing a lot of connections with that. I mean, we talk about the Maori people of New Zealand and the kumara, the sweet potato, and the ability of the warriors to be farmers at the same time, the ability to just pack up and go. There wasn't much cultivation required. Whereas the grain crops you talk about, I mean, they need to be grown, they have a seasonal rotation, they need to be harvested, they need to be processed and threshed, and there's a whole process. And then the final good is then highly stable. You can hold on to it for a long time. You can store it. Same with rice. And so I can see what you're saying. There's this sort of inherent organization of grain crops, which, as you say, leads to its ability to be confiscated, but they're also highly calorific, I guess, is that a word? They're very nutritious. And I mean, how do they compare though? Because you get things like the potato, which is also a superfood. You can live off of a potato. So what is the difference there?
The Meshar and Moav article, it says that the difference is their article says that the difference has to do not with so much with calorific density, but with confiscatability. So potatoes, they're very densely calorific, and they grow and they are favored in certain kinds of environments. And you'll see, in fact, there's an interesting story they tell about when the potato was imported and even promoted by Frederick the Great in Prussia. It created problems for the tax collectors because suddenly they had the people living off of the land and they didn't know how much they were growing, and they could not confiscate or sort of see. They couldn't take a census. It was invisible, so to speak. So it's not so much the calorific density. It's that is the important aspect. And one of the things they say towards the end of that article is that, and this is why I wanted to point out why this unconfiscatability in the end, a kind of mixed blessing, because they come to the conclusion that the unconfiscatability of tubers and root crops means that those places that are favored for that kind of crop do not develop institutions that lead to greater prosperity in the long term. So, such as courts and laws and contracts and international trade, because you can survive by yourself. You don't need to trade. And so you see, even now, Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel talks about disease and various kinds of agricultural packages that moved east to west rather than north to south. But another aspect to that is that places that are able to survive easily on tuber crops have no incentive to develop the institutions that manage that kind of dialogue between the people who don't want their grain confiscated and the state, or the organized crime that becomes the state to confiscate it. So there's a kind of dialogue there, a détente, a face-to-face, that out of which emerges a bunch of institutions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And for us here in Japan, we certainly see that relationship with rice, and Asia more broadly has this. Rice is just an incredibly portable form of money, a form of food, a form of governance. That you can weigh it. It's highly fungible and divisible.
And it's quite interesting if you study. I'm not an expert in Japanese history, but I do know that, and people who travel in Japan will recognize that, okay, it's a rice culture, but actually the most common grain that people eat is probably here either buckwheat or wheat in the form of noodles. So noodles were poor people's food that they grew on poorer land. Buckwheat grows anywhere, so does barley. But rice you had to grow on the good land, and rice they used almost exclusively for taxation. So the only people who got rice en masse were the local daimyo. So in fact, you can see right here that grain, the rice culture is really, the rice was the form of tax.
Yeah, it's interesting because we still see that emerging. Well, we see that continuing today with some of the subsidies and the kind of the use of land, where you've got these kind of grandma, grandpa, running a small plot of rice, which is highly unproductive. Like they're not. It's productive land in the sense that they're getting a good yield, but certainly compared to other parts of Asia, it's not really that profitable, and so it has to be subsidized, and yet it's got so much political power. And you've got these organizations like JA and the kind of Japan Agriculture who are maintaining that kind of myth of the primacy of rice, whereas the reality is most Japanese people are eating bread and they're eating noodles,
Yeah, I think there's obviously a highly symbolic character to that. So these rice it's a symbol, it's an historic symbol of the Japanese state.
Well, the intersection of that, so coming back to a New Zealand perspective, and I'm not sure how much you know about this, and even for myself, it's a historical moment, but that relationship between, say, the colonizing force of Great Britain, of England, and the Maori people of New Zealand, and the way those two things kind of those two things interfaced through the land wars that happened in New Zealand. My ancestor on the British side of my family was in the British Army and was involved in that series of skirmishes throughout the North Island, and you saw these they called them pa, the sort of the defensive fortifications of the Maori, which were very very robust, some of the earliest forms of trench warfare, but the ability for the Maori to basically do tactical retreats and just up and go was highly powerful and extremely effective, because they didn't have to sustain the losses of kind of the defending the grain, defending the kind of the wealth that was embedded in there. They could take a couple of tubers with them, they could rebuild and reform, and that only really started to wind down as they lost their warriors, who were also the farmers, because they didn't have that same division of labour. And again, this is sort of the apocryphal take on it. There's a lot more to it, but that was really interesting. That kind of, and alongside the introduction of the musket, which was the kind of the classic game-changing, phase change technology.
Right.
That's how they operated, and there was, within New Zealand, there wasn't a sort of a unified Maori identity. It was very tribal. And so you had the warring tribes and the peaceful tribes, and sort of the borders between them were very loose and undefined, and sort of the changing nature of weather and of nature, of kind of the seasons, meant that sometimes you would lose a bit of land, or you would let it go to regrow and that sort of thing. So it's a very different approach to organising compared to what we're talking about here, which is rectangular plots of land where you grow maize and corn.
I'm anxious to see. You talked about how and where does Bitcoin fit into this, and in this sense, we're talking about Bitcoin as the particular characteristic we're interested in is unconfiscatability. Now, I think in the face of a violent state and torture, we'll see how unconfiscatable those private keys are. But I think that's a very interesting characteristic of it.
Well, we sort of joke, we call it Bitcorn.
Yeah.
But maybe we need to call it Bit Potato or something, because you can take it with you. Yeah. You can have it in your pocket. You can have it in your mind. And I guess what I'm interested in is how does that relate back to some of what in the Sovereign Individual they talk about mega political change and kind of technology, kind of paradigm shifting technology, gunpowder, printing presses, these kinds of things. How does the ability to have money that is unconfiscatable change the paradigm, the relationship with the state that we haven't really seen in the form of money?
Right.
Like we haven't seen that innovation before. It's new.
It's new. It is new. And I think, again, that sort of, it's really impossible to predict in the future what will happen, partly because although Bitcoin is a very simple form of computing, it requires quite a lot of global reach in order to function, to have its to have it be uncensorable, to be distributed. It requires telephony, it requires electricity, it requires all of the functions of the modern state to be working, and it also requires all of the communication lines to remain open. And I think I don't see that disappearing, but it certainly is sort of a risk.
Possibly. However, I think when you do break it down and you look at, say, the communication lines you talk about, in terms of encryption, in terms of private networks and Tor and things like that, I think the ability to censor packets of data is impossible. And we've seen that with, we're talking about LibGen and sharing books and pirating academic material. It's impossible to stop. So that's one thing. But the reality of the resilience of the network, I have a personal copy of the blockchain.
Yeah.
I'm sure you do too. And so it only takes one node. It's like a potato.
Yeah.
It only takes one to regrow the entire crop. Right. And if you go, there's some interesting stuff if you look at genetics around, breeds and hybrids of different kind of crops. You get F1, you get F2, the children of a certain hybrid of a species. And, you only need the parent in this case, or any copy to reproduce it perfectly. And maybe that's similar to the potato, where you just plug and play. Apples are very different, as you know. Apples have a phenotype, and you have to graft the tree onto a rootstock, and the children of the seeds of an apple, the trees that come from the seeds of an apple will always be bitter, and they won't be as delicious as the original tree. Whereas with something like a potato, it's copy paste, and with Bitcoin, it's the same approach.
Yeah. What I'm most interested in that regard is the ability of this unconfiscatable money to exercise competition. I think that's one of the things that's severely lacking in the currency space. Like, you have commodities like gold, which historically have functioned as money, still have many of the attributes of money. But most of the world's money are fiat currencies, central banks manipulating interest rates, governments. issuing bonds. That's the basis of the financial system. But you get something that's widespread. And like you've talked about in your other podcasts, this different form of the first past the post voting that you get, where you vote for both the candidate and the party, where you can get very small coalitions, and a very small party can have an outsized effect. And you see this in any kind of competitive market. You don't, the juggernaut, say in this case, the US dollar, it doesn't need to have something replace it completely, immediately, for it to have an effect. You can have, say, Bitcoin reach a certain percentage, a certain clout, have certain characteristics that actually force competition upon the rest of the system.
Well, along those lines, I think we talk about decentralization as a key word in all of this. And I think decentralization of decentralization is also really important. And so what I mean by that, again, I keep referencing the sovereign individual, but we saw this period of democracy and majority-based rule in many parts of the world, and in fact, a lot of similarities with democratic systems and communist systems in the ultimate organization of the mode of production. And in one of them, it was state centralized. The other one was it's up to the individual, but you still have to pay your taxes to the state, and so it was ergo centralized. And so the authors argue that these two systems, in 1991, when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, effectively weren't that different. There was still this centralizing power of the state, and it was just one enabled individual enterprise, and one was directed by the state itself directly. And obviously the capitalistic democratic system won out, but that only was possible during this period of the 20th century, where the only way to sort of succeed in the world was to have the most battleships and the most weapons and the most people available to fight wars. And that was this period of massive build-up of industry, the massive build-up of standing armies and all of this stuff. But decentralizing that in a world of Bitcoin where there's nothing to attack, the Bitcoin is locked away in private keys. Even if you've got the battleships and the aircraft carriers and the nuclear weapons, you're not going to be able to take the Bitcoin. It perhaps enables alternative ways of organizing society. And this is where the authors talk about the Knights Templar, the Order of, are you going to correct me, the ambulance people, the Order of St. John, these kind of small micro, in some cases religious states, in some cases secular states, but they weren't democratically elected governments. Are we going to see, as we move into a Bitcoin standard perhaps, the ability of a theocracy to emerge that's actually highly competitive globally, or of a secular group of buddies, building a nation state, these kinds of alternative systems potentially?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of room for alternative systems, and there's a number of proposals that are being worked on now. Of course, you know of the networked state proposals, which talk about decentralized state-like entities. You have nations like Estonia offering e-citizenship, and what may that provide? Other countries probably going to offer that. You have also a movement about free cities, or basically new city-states that carve out a kind of jurisdiction for themselves, marketing, subcontracting justice with other entities. I think it's lots of things become possible when you have a real free movement of money between places.
Well, it enables innovation on the governance layer, and I think that's what I'm really interested in. And I think that this is ultimately, again, looking at, say, fourth turning, sovereign individual themes, this is something that's emerging, is that more and more individuals and communities can live in these alternative ways and these new ways of being, and they don't have to be plugged into a system. And I really noticed that it's quite clear to me, being in Japan, where it's a very industrious society. People ride the train, they go to work, they do the thing, and they come home. The salary man, it's kind of a cultural concept. And I'm thinking, man, I'm just sitting here doing my thing and kind of amongst it, and I'm a provocateur. I'm doing interventions artistically in the street to try and expose what this means, because it's now archaic. They just don't know it yet. And I think this deference to a system a centralized system is now out, and it's just we're at the early stage of that. But I mean, we're seeing the same things in New Zealand. The ability to have a job for life it's long gone. You and I, our generation, never had that opportunity, but certainly that myth has been dispelled. So what are we left with? It's down to individuals, communities, these kind of micro communities. What does that mean for the nation state? This is something I struggle with. I both love and hate New Zealand. What does it even mean? And that's where we get into culture. We get into religion. Like, how do you organize? Because we're not just Austrian economic actors here who are, purely trying to maximize our profit. We are trying to seek out meaning, belonging. I don't know, how do you see that stuff connecting?
Well, I think there really is a collapse or a hollowing out of a number of the ways in which individuals have solidified their identities since the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of nation states. You've talked about your love-hate relationship with New Zealand. I mean, the very notion that there's a New Zealand to love or hate comes from that period, comes from the revolutionary struggles, although there were not, that wasn't like that in New Zealand, but a lot of countries formed their identity over and against some kind of oppressor. And there's a whole mythology that was partly manufactured, partly mined, certainly reinforced by a whole artistic, cultural apparatus. And so that's, I think about my own mother, for example, who was born to Swedish immigrants who had some Swedish identity, but maybe not as much as my mom, who saw that as a kind of touchstone. And, like many children of immigrants, probably loved a culture that ended 150 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but even that, because I mean, there's a whole idea of like places that don't exist anymore. And you get people who were born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or they were born in Imperial Taiwan when it was part of Japan, or they were born in a country that no longer exists. And these kind of middle, we call it kind of not third culture, but the sort of non-existent ideas,
orphaned ideas.
I find that very interesting because we don't see a huge amount of it. That it certainly exists, but like, I mean, post-Soviet Union, I think there was a big movement there around like, well, what does it mean to be a Soviet citizen, to have the passport, to have or maybe not a passport, but to have the documentation, the birth certificates, all of that from, the People's Republic of X. Whereas now, I don't know, where do we see that emerging? In a lot of places, identity has been solidified. You get the dashed lines every now and then on a map, but it's not that common, and so we don't really have it as a talking point.
Yeah,
the 13 states, the 13 original colonies, like that's now been locked in.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that reading this literature by Scott and by Moab and Meshar, etc., have done is, Scott talks about seeing like a state, but I think, first of all, you have to see the state. And I think this is something that it's taken a while. I feel like it's like this solution that you just put a few drops into it, and suddenly all this stuff precipitates out of it. It's finally you can see.
It's like a litmus test, right?
Well, you can kind of see what was there before, and we don't see that. We just think naturally in terms of state. And we just said, for example, you grow up, you're an athlete, or just somebody who likes sports. You watch the Olympics, or you watch the World Cup, and it's country against country, and that seems natural. There's really nothing really natural about that. And that really was a project. All of that stuff stems from late 19th, early 20th century projects of almost with peace, kind of peaceful war between nations, embodying that. But the idea of having these national identities grouped around cultures and a birth and a kind of identity is something that's really difficult to see. It's the water in which we're swimming.
Well, this is where I fall back on my cultural studies kind of background, it was the easiest possible thing I could study along with Japanese literature at university. And so I thought, fuck, I just need the degree so I can get a visa to get the fuck out of here. And so I did culture studies, and I was deep in it. And I remember on the first day, our professor said to me, look, by the end of this degree, you will all be Marxists. And I remember taking that comment quite seriously and really reflecting on it. And so, we studied all of it, the Frankfurt School, Raymond Williams. Culture is one or two most difficult words in the English language to define. He talks about capital C culture, lowercase c culture, and sort of the class struggle and all of that. And I mean, people shit on this area of study, but what it did is it inoculated me. And so I've seen it all, and I understand the arguments. Theodore Adorno talks about how the industrialization of the world, of processes, led to the industrialization of music, the development of the 3-minute pop song, as opposed to the 4-day sonata, the Wagner, the Ring of the Nibelungs, and so there's a lot of that goes into it. But where am I going with this? Like, there is an approach to understanding national identity, which I think is perhaps new in a Bitcoin discussion, but it's been talked about for a long time, and a lot of these cultural studies people talk about it, and they're obviously coming at it from a Marxist communist perspective, but there's certainly, I think, a lot we can take from that. I don't think rejecting the theories outright is productive. I think we should be intimate with those theories.
Yeah. I think I don't think nation states are going to be disappearing anytime particularly soon. I don't think the U.S. dollar is going to be going away anytime particularly soon. It may have some struggles, but I think having active experiments going on the side is really important.
Yeah, well, I mean, New Zealand has been described as an experiment, to be fair. I mean, as it talked about, MMP, mixed member of parliament, women's suffrage, the colonial project, one of the youngest countries in the world. It's certainly been a site of intervention, and given its small population, they've been able to activate a lot of these changes, and I mean, relatively stably. It's not a chaotic place, so it's kind of like it's a really good test bed. Yeah. And we saw that with COVID as well.
Yeah. Negative as well.
Yeah. I just want to talk a little bit about another book you shared, which I've actually had a chance to read. So David Graeber's Debt.
Oh, yes.
The First 5,000 Years.
Right.
So I read this a few years back, so it's a little bit hazy, but it sort of, would you say, I mean, my take on it was that it really dispels the idea of barter as kind of the original form of money or of value exchange, and really that debt and kind of owing someone was the original form of value and of kind of money. I mean, how did you find that book? What was your take on it?
Well, my main takeaway from that, and again, it's still a little fuzzy in my mind as well, but it reminded me of a seminar I had in graduate school with a really eminent historian of late antiquity, and the whole class was on wealth and poverty in late antiquity, and he asked us, what's the first instance of the word poor ever in any kind of archaeological record? The word poor, and it turns out the word poor is written on a bronze statuette that had been presented to the monarch from your poor servant. Right. So you see, what's interesting there is that clearly this is a client-patron relationship between somebody who is very far from poor, but the use of the word poverty is a relational, client-centric word. So he was in debt to him. And what I really loved, what I like about Graeber's work is he also shows how money, talking about the history of money and its quantifiability, starts first as debt. All of those cuneiform tablets, there's just mountains of these middens full of these things that are just tallies of paying off the debt, tallies of taxes. And before you get money, 2,500 years before you get money, you have people exchanging debts. So actually money, it has as much pedigree in debt as it does as any kind of commodity money like gold or silver or electrum or whatever was developed.
Well, in those earlier times as well, I mean, the ability, the availability of consumer goods or whatever was non-existent, and so your existence was coming back to a more of a calorific kind of, you know, being able to clothe and feed yourself, basically. Right. And so maybe there wasn't the need for the innovation of what we would think of as currency, you know, and that just like, you know, maybe even in our lifetimes, you know, computers, all of these things, as technology improves, you know, we become accustomed to it and we require it and we demand it. But there was no need for our grandparents to have computers, and they didn't have them. It was, I mean, it's tautological, but you know, if all you're doing is growing, you know, growing potatoes, and you're, you know, living a very simple life, maybe it's just the debt of the debt that you owe to your Lord that is denominated in, you know, in some papyrus or something, you know, like.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this, and historically in the ancient Near East, and this comes out of people who study archaeology in the Fertile Crescent, you talked about whether they had need for money, and actually a very interesting thing happened between the Persian and the Babylonian empires, and that at the time when money started to be invented. So those of you, and I come from teaching theological seminary, we all know about the Assyrian Empire came in and hauled off the people in northern Israel. Now, it's been assumed by modern historians, well, they just hauled off the elite. They were kind of imprisoning them and wanting their expertise. But in fact, that was not the case. They actually hauled them off. And the reason they did so is that at that time, wealth was your labor. And what they wanted to do in order to expand their state, they needed more labor. This is very Malthusian, right? They needed to take in increase their population so that they could increase their cut. Why? Well, because you couldn't transport it. You couldn't transport grain any amount of distance. It was no use occupying a place for the land if you couldn't confiscate the wealth from it. However, once money starts to be circulating, it completely changes how you can have your imperial arrangements. You can actually very easily tax from a long distance away, and you can let people stay in their place. And that's what happened with Persia, and then later with Greece, and then finally with the Roman Empire. You see a fully financialized empire, which is based mostly upon taxation in the form of money. Now, some of it in the form of grain, but also in the form of money.
That's interesting. So you talk, it's almost like a layer of abstraction of value that, you know, some directive, some idea could be birthed in Rome and it would manifest itself in northern England. And, you know, sort of, I'm just trying to think, what's that system, the Hawala system? Are you familiar with that? I think it's Hawala system. It's like money exchanges throughout the Middle East.
Oh, yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah, so it's sort of this, it's still human in the sense that it's people, but it's a network effect. And so at the base layer, it's literally confiscating the people and bringing them on the boat or bringing them with you. But as you develop these technological innovations, you can actually abstract that out. And now perhaps, you know, with Bitcoin, that's abstracted to another level where, I mean, we exist within the nation state. You know, we're here in the room, you know, the sovereign territory of Japan, but we're also living on another layer where we have, it's kind of thinking about the technology analogy would be something like a VPN or some sort of, you know, tunneling system where we're able to kind of transact value from, you know, through the clear net of the nation state, but it's in a very private and confidential, unconfiscatable way. That's an innovation that enables us to kind of, I mean, take advantage, kind of the pendulum swings back away from state control, centralized control, back to the individual, which is kind of this classic, you know, move of times, a kind of fourth turning idea.
Yeah, I think that we'll see how it develops with this unconfiscatable wealth, but the notion of creating this internal network really is what made the Italian bankers in the 13th, 14th century succeed, is they were able to have a banking network, and they had central reserves, and all they had to do was to transport bills of sale, and that were eventually settled in one way or another. But you had really a network, and often they would send coded messages. And interestingly enough, they continued to send handwritten newsletters well into the 18th century. Why? Well, because they didn't want a printer to be involved at all. They would have a scribe and they would print it and then it would be read. And then it had a kind of confidentiality, somewhat like, I don't know, think of it like an encrypted message. It may have even written in code. I'm not sure about that. But you have this network based upon, it was gold, or probably to some degree silver was being transferred, but it was really the value was being transferred, that the money was not being transferred.
You've just reminded me, is it Neil Stephenson who talks about, I might be confusing things, but he talks about the development of the transatlantic telegraph cables and that sort of thing, and how that enabled stock markets to move at the speed of light. So previously, sort of the sell order would have to go on the boat, and it was really difficult to organise all of that. Whereas as soon as you had the telegraph and the tally ticker and these pieces of technology, you were able to have the London and the New York Stock Exchange talk to each other and align, and that accelerated the speed of capital. And I might be conflating this with some other ideas, but that led to the development of fiat because you needed it to move at the speed of light. Yeah,
I've heard that as well. That in fact the telegraph spelled the end of the gold standard. I mean, and it facilitated it during maybe the first 50, 60 years, but then it spelled its end because that the settlement was unable to be settled at the same speed.
I've got a question for you, coming back to Christianity. Yeah. So you talk about job.
Yeah.
Is that word related to having a job in any way? Sorry, silly question.
I actually don't know. I don't think so, but I don't. That seems like a very old English word.
Doing the work, doing
the job. You mean like Job, as in the suffering prophet of Israel? I don't know.
Sorry, is that how Job is? Sorry, this is just off topic. Coming back though, I mean, started this conversation about pilgrimages. Yeah. Hopefully after this we're going to head out to Enoshima and visit the island. But the proof of work of pilgrimages, that really struck me as something quite profound. I think we live just more broadly in a society that's very, what would you call it? Instant gratification is the norm. Highly connected.
High time preference.
I mean, you've done this long walk from Erfurt, Germany to Rome. You've done a lot of walking and a lot of these kind of deep meditations sort of on foot. I mean, just generally, tell me more about that. Like, how do you see? Do you see a re-emergence perhaps of that kind of long format way of being? What does the future look like?
I sure hope so. I think. We're talking about decentralization of all kinds of different services. I see what I did with my wife as a 3-month, we took 70 days, but I would like to have spent longer, think of it like a college semester, walking between, say, Wittenberg in Germany and Rome, and making of that a classroom or a whole semester's worth of study. I just think of something like that now with the decentralization of information being feasible in a way which, when you needed to go to the library to read the chained books, it's kind of like the opposite of that. Just imagine what may happen with historical artistic education if you can unchain it from the classroom, from the library, and bring it out onto the land in a way. So when I think about that pilgrimage, I get really excited about what's possible. You speak about what kinds of ways we may be free to be living, and pedagogically, I mean, everybody knows that travel is an amazing experience, and a lot of that is because people do it out of their own motivations. They discover, there's a serendipity, they discover things, and you can't program all of that. But just compare a classroom. We're here sitting in a room and we're speaking of the great truths of the universe. That can also be exciting. But just imagine the difference in one's own, the depth and strength of one's own memory when it happens on the road and in a place. When you see this was the limit of the Roman Empire, and you see the little trench in the ground that's still there after 2,000 years, or you walk by a castle that was stayed in by this person who you're reading about. I mean, it's a bit cliche, and I don't quite know how to articulate it, but there's something to that.
There's another a piece of fiction that I really enjoyed called A Canticle for Leibowitz.
Oh, yes, I love that book.
Are you familiar with it?
Yes, I'm very familiar with it. Yeah.
And so it really aligns with sort of what you just talked about. So this sort of, to summarize it, I guess it's this post-apocalyptic story, the world, and it was written, I think, in the 60s. And so the world has gone through this nuclear war, and there's this re-emergence of this kind of monastic order, which has this kind of, these objects of the monastery are old schematics and blueprints from these different engineers and people who lived in the time of civilization. And it's this kind of story of how civilization is able to be rebuilt and kind of intertwined with a lot of Christian imagery. And I found it really profound because it makes me think about something like Bitcoin and the work that we're doing today kind of in this system. And there's a lot of existential questions around, I see there's just been some US soldiers killed in Jordan or something. What does that mean for escalation in the Middle East? There's obviously ongoing conflict in many parts of the world. There is, and I don't think about this stuff too much, but there is, some real concern that maybe are we heading towards war, towards destruction? What will exist though after that? Is it that we have these kind of 12, 24 words put up into this very elevated into this kind of position where they represent wealth? They're kind of the artifacts that our ancestors have handed down to us, and they are an embodiment of wealth. And the way that someone like Satoshi or these early Bitcoiners of the 21st century were able to build and give us the system that we can benefit from kind of after this great calamity. It's very it's quite a powerful thing to kind of play with. But what if there is this great challenge to the world's way of being? We kind of go through the filter, we come out the other side, and we rebuild systems, kind of similar to, say, the fall of the Roman Empire, these kinds of things. Yeah,
well, I think I'm not alone. You're not alone. We're not alone in thinking that something like what happened over the 150 years after the printing press is in the process of happening now. I mean, it's hard for us to see. We're in the middle of it, but the globalization and of information accessibility, it's unprecedented, and you can already see it having political effects everywhere. I mean, right now, this is the U.S. election year, and it's really interesting to read public opinion. Now, people's lives are generally okay. We're not in a state of civil war, but because of the novel ways in which information is now circulating, there's all kinds of conflicts and imagined conflicts, real conflicts that are now coming to the fore that would not have been voiced before. And so I think we're in for a rough few decades. Now, it may not be hot war, it may be a cold war, as I think is already happening. But it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, and I think looking at A Canticle for Leibowitz, I certainly found that very inspiring. It's sort of broken up into a few different stories, but very much the idea of the monk, the pilgrimage, the kind of the connection of technology and religion, and sort of the myth making and the kind of the value and the kind of, what would you call it, the search for meaning that came out for me.
And it was somewhat arbitrary in that book that it was schematics that they preserved and illuminated and passed along, and that became the basis of a new technological society. I mean, that story is very Promethean, or maybe even Pandora's box, and its worry about, I think, nuclear destruction in particular. But this, I think we guard that and the human mind, and this is where I, as a theologian, might think that the structure of that is established or is divinely ordered, so to speak, to achieve certain insights.
I wonder if the natural ordering, the kingly ordering power of something like Christ, of the way that it gives order, a sense of order to the universe, is part of this underlying movement towards creating systems that create order. It's kind of like the pilgrimage to create, the proof of work to create a governance system, a hierarchy, from a family structure all the way up to a nation state. Is it an attempt to replicate the organization that is bestowed upon the world by God?
That certainly is the claim of certain kinds of natural theology. That this is the world is an echo of the Creator. I think, like a cryptographic equation, though, that only works one way. You don't get to go backwards to figure out what God is like from what God has created. But yeah, I think that is a traditional and I think valid ongoing insight that we see, and this is where the Christian tradition, as a very rich witness, is that it's faith, and Christ says, "Let those with ears hear, or let those with eyes see." So there's something that what faith does, we would say, is it animates the perceptions to be able to see that. Whereas one may, in a strictly Darwinian scientific way, see only violence, blood and tooth and claw. Through the eyes of faith, one can see the beauty and the order.
One final question for you, Andrew. You're talking about this work you're doing personally to translate the 16th century Spanish.
Yes, Spanish Dominican Bartolomé de las Casas.
Is there anything in there as you've gone through this translation project that's really made you think, wow, you sort of connect with them, you understand sort of what they're going through, this sort of sense of solidarity over 400, 500 years?
What's really affected me in the particular translation that I'm doing is how rhetorically rich his language is, with images from the classics, but also from Scripture. For example, he speaks of Jesus' mission as sending sheep among wolves. But you, the Spanish crown, you have sent wolves among the sheep. So there's a very simple metaphor, but that's just multiplied 1,000 times in every sentence, is full of these allusions. And I've had the fortune of being raised with those scriptures in such a way that I'm able to kind of tacitly recognize a lot of those in a way that I think maybe a lot of secular people today would not be able to sort of see, oh yeah, he's quoting Paul, or oh, that's a phrase from the Gospel of John, or that certainly sounds like Ezekiel to me, or, you're not gonna, it's not a quote. It's what biblical scholars would call a kind of figural, he's pointing to certain kinds of figures. So I think it's really just been amazing to see how it's the same figures from Scripture that are able to animate that rhetoric, and I think one of the ways in which our own discourse is impoverished and it's just sheer instrumentality. We just have clear, you read prose from today, compare it with American journalism from the 19th century. I mean, it's flowery. I mean, there's all these allusions in it. It's much more Baroque. And you read a newspaper today or a nonfiction book today, and you can almost predict what it's going to be saying. It's so formulaic.
Well, you can. ChatGPT does it for you.
Yeah, and the reason ChatGPT can do it is because it is it's in some sense already algorithmic.
Andrew, is there anything else you'd like to share or bring up? Anything at all?
Yeah, just one more point. One story that I told you that I think would be very interesting to Bitcoiners today about inflation and fiat, I mentioned indulgences. One of the things that's not so well known about indulgences is that they underwent a fiat inflation. You can imagine that in an era when they're written on parchment by hand, sealed with wax, little tassels. If you've seen them in museums, they're beautiful artifacts, but they're also very expensive artifacts. What happened is that after Gutenberg put together the first printing press, he started printing the Bible, by which he lost money. He went out of business, and it could have been some shenanigans by his financier, but that never made any money. The thing that did make money for him and for all the other early printers was contract work with the church. So they were printing pamphlets, but among those, a lot of indulgences, thousands, millions, over the 60 years, 70 years between the printing press and the time of Luther, you had an escalating involvement of the printing industry in printing indulgences for an increasingly frivolous reasons. So at the beginning, it was just like a copy of they just like the first Bible. It was just a print and copy of what would have been written by hand before, but there was an asymptotic curve to the number of those. And so in the decade before Luther's indulgence, there was a particular entrepreneur, you might call him a religious entrepreneur, who basically sold his services to local ecclesiastics and say, here's how you can raise a bunch of money. And so he started printing out these indulgences, and they would use them for financing. And so in the end, when Luther wrote his 95 Theses, what had happened is that Albrecht, who was already the Bishop of Brandenburg, and again, you have to think of this more like they're more like kings than like prelates. He wanted a new office, which is to become the Archbishop of Mainz. And why did he want that office? Well, he knew that the current Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian was on his last legs, and the new Holy Roman Emperor would be elected. And at that time, election means you buy, right? And then the bishopric of Mainz was an elector of the Holy Roman Emperor. So he said, I want that office. I'm going to buy it. So he went to the Fuggers in Augsburg, and he said, can you finance this? And they said, yeah, we can do it, but we need some guarantees. And the guarantee that got him most of the money to buy that office was the license to issue an indulgence. But that was sketchy too. So he had to go to the papacy, and the papacy said, yes, you can do that. But you need to send part of it to Rome. And so he issued an indulgence to pay off the debt that he'd used to buy the office, part of which went to Rome for the right to issue it. And there was that particular indulgence. Again, after 70 years of there was just increasing, people would pay less and less and less for an indulgence, and there were more and more and more of them. And finally, the friars, who were the ones who were in charge of doing the sacrament of confession and confession, absolution, and penance, people were just buying slips of paper and saying they didn't need to do this traditional spiritual practice. So anyway, it's a very interesting connection there with this advent of a new technology. Allowed the inflation value of indulgences to go through the roof, and in some ways, that fiat printing of novel money, which was used financially by prelates as a fundraising scheme, really led to that particular protest.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's almost like the decline in the meaning of that project was undermined by the fairness of it.
Yeah.
I don't need to go to church anymore. I can sin because I can just pay my way with these indulgences, these pieces of paper.
Yeah.
There's this fiat money. It's all connected, Andrew. But hey, I appreciate your time and for sharing your knowledge. It's extremely inspiring. I've got some more reading to do. I'm sure we'll be communicating more over email about some of these ideas. But I really appreciate you coming out here, and thank you.
Well, I appreciate for the invitation. I really enjoy Bitcoin meetups and people as much because I think we're talking about interesting things and really trying to get to the heart of a lot of things that are simply talked about superficially in other circles.
Well, we're going to go for our own pilgrimage now, so we'll wrap it up there. But thank you very much. And cool.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Allingham, and that was the Transformation of Value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.